In the late 1990s, Silicon Valley loved a good secret, and few secrets were bigger than Transmeta. Here was a tiny, mysterious startup in Santa Clara, funded in part by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, whispering that it was building a new kind of microprocessor. Not just a faster chip, but something so different, it might make Intel's mighty x86 empire look old overnight. The company refused to say exactly what it was doing. It poached elite chip designers, ex-DEC and Sun engineers, and in 1997 hired one of the most famous names in computing, Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux. When word got out that Torvalds had joined the secretive hardware startup, the rumor mill exploded. Was Transmeta building a post-PC architecture? A Linux on a chip revolution? A processor that could run Windows and Linux faster and cooler than anything Intel had? For years, nobody outside the company really knew. But in January 2000, Transmeta finally stepped out of the shadows, put a name to its crown jewel, Crusoe, and promised nothing less than to rewrite the rules of laptop computing. Transmeta was founded in 1995 by a small group of ambitious engineers, including Dave Ditzel, a veteran of Bell Labs and Sun Microsystems, and a strong believer in RISC philosophy. The idea that simpler instruction sets and smarter compilers could beat complex hardware. From the outset, Transmeta set itself apart in two ways. First, it was built around a contrarian idea that the future of computing lay in stripping down the processor hardware and moving much of the complexity into software. Second, it wrapped that idea in extraordinary secrecy. The company operated almost like a skunkworks lab. Its offices were unmarked, employees signed strict non-disclosure agreements. Publicly, executives offered only vague statements about low-powered chips and new architectures. Internally, they were chasing a radical goal. A processor that looked like an x86 chip to the outside world, but didn't actually execute x86 instructions in hardware. For years, Transmeta raised money, grew its team, and refined its designs with almost no public product. In an era when most startups had to ship quickly or die, Transmeta's long, quiet gestation only fueled the narrative that something truly disruptive was brewing behind closed doors. On January 19, 2000, in a highly anticipated press event, Transmeta finally revealed what it had been building, the Crusoe processor. In demos and slides, executives painted a vision tailor-made for the coming mobile era. Laptops, they argued, were held back by hot, power-hungry Intel chips. Battery life was measured in a couple of hours, fans were loud, and notebooks were heavy. Crusoe, they said, would change that. Crusoe wasn't about raw speed. It was about extreme power efficiency and low heat. It would let manufacturers build smaller, thinner, fanless machines, the kind of ultra-portable devices that, at the time, were still rare and exotic. Transmeta promised all-day battery life and silent, cool operation. The story sounded revolutionary, a chip that could run existing x86 software, Windows, Linux, Office apps, browsers, but sip power like a handheld gadget. The hype matched the years of secrecy. For a brief moment, it looked like Intel finally had a serious, unconventional challenger in the notebook world. Under the marketing, Crusoe was genuinely unusual. At its heart was a very simple, low-power VLIW core, a very long instruction word design. Unlike Intel's complex x86 cores, Crusoe's hardware was streamlined, with the goal of saving power and die area. The twist was that Crusoe didn't expose this VLIW instruction set to software developers at all. Instead, it ran a layer of software called code morphing. This software sat between the x86 programs and the hardware, translating the x86 instructions into Crusoe's native VLIW instructions on the fly. In practical terms, your operating system and applications thought they were running on a normal x86 processor. Behind the scenes, code morphing took each basic block of x86 code, converted and optimized it for the VLIW engine, and cached the translated result. The next time that code ran, Crusoe could reuse the optimized version instead of translating it again. This was a bold break with tradition. For decades, chipmakers had been implementing x86 instructions directly in hardware, layering on more and more complexity. Transmeta tried the opposite. Keep hardware simple and flexible and rely on smart software translation to handle the ugly details of the instruction set. The code morphing approach enabled several theoretical advantages. First, by simplifying the hardware, Crusoe could be made smaller and cooler. Fewer transistors devoted to complex decoders and legacy features meant lower power consumption and potentially cheaper manufacturing. That fit perfectly with a world that was beginning to care less about desktop performance and more about mobility. Second, because the x86 compatibility layer was in software, it could be updated. Bugs in instruction handling, performance optimizations, even support for some new instruction extensions could in principle be delivered as software updates rather than etched in silicon forever. That was a very different mindset from Intel's model, where fixing an erratum often meant spinning an entirely new chip revision. Third, code morphing could, at least on paper, apply aggressive optimizations to real-world workloads that a traditional hardware pipeline might not catch. It could analyze code patterns over time, reorder operations for Crusoe's VLIW core, and skip over rarely used paths. Around 2000, this software-centric vision felt almost science-fictional to many observers. The idea that a modest piece of silicon, guided by clever code translation, might stand toe-to-toe with Intel's intricate processors was a big part of Crusoe's aura. Crusoe's reason for being was mobility. Transmeta consciously avoided the high-end desktop and server markets. Instead, it targeted ultra-portables, sub-notebooks, and embedded devices where battery life and heat mattered far more than peak performance. The chips implemented aggressive power management features. Crusoe used a technique Transmeta branded as long run, which dynamically adjusted clock speed and voltage based on workload to minimize energy usage. When a laptop was idle or lightly loaded, Crusoe could run at a lower frequency and voltage, cutting power draw dramatically. When more performance was needed, it could ramp up temporarily. In an era when many laptops ran hot, with fans constantly spinning, the idea of a cool, silent notebook with greatly extended battery life was compelling. Transmeta's marketing leaned hard into images of thin machines, fanless designs, and road warriors working all day without hunting for power outlets. Whether every claim held up in practice is debatable, but the focus on power efficiency and smart dynamic control of the processor foreshadowed a shift that would define the next 2 decades of computing. As 2000 progressed, Crusoe began showing up in real products. Several laptop makers, especially those interested in ultra-portables, signed on. Sony used Crusoe in some of its Bio Picturebook and other ultra-compact models, touting lightweight and long battery life. These machines demonstrated what Transmeta wanted to enable: tiny, almost handheld-sized computers running full desktop operating systems. IBM experimented with Crusoe in some ThinkPad models, and other manufacturers in Asia released niche devices, internet appliances, and thin, light notebooks built around Transmeta chips. Fanless or near-silent designs became a selling point in a few of these systems. The early tech press coverage was enthusiastic but also cautious. Reviewers praised the boldness of the approach and the potential for better battery life, but they also ran benchmarks, and the numbers told a more complicated story. Crusoe's biggest technical gamble was always performance. Code morphing introduced overhead. Before the VLIW core could run a new piece of x86 code efficiently, it had to translate and optimize it. Over time, with caching, that overhead could be amortized. But in many real-world workloads, especially bursty desktop usage, that ideal scenario didn't always materialize. In independent benchmarks, Crusoe chips typically lagged behind contemporary Intel mobile processors, like low-voltage Pentium 3s in raw speed. Applications that relied heavily on integer performance or that frequently touched new code paths exposed the translation cost. Some reviewers noted jittery or inconsistent responsiveness compared with Intel-based rivals. On the power front, results were mixed. In some carefully designed ultra-portable systems, Crusoe did enable impressive battery life and cool operation. But when matched against increasingly efficient Intel designs and similar form factors, the advantage was not always dramatic. Marketing promises of all-day battery life sometimes turned into more modest gains in practice. None of this meant Crusoe was a bad product, but in a market conditioned to equate performance numbers with value, the gap between Transmeta's revolutionary narrative and its everyday benchmark results created a sense of letdown. Transmeta's window of opportunity was always going to be narrow, and Intel and AMD moved quickly to close it. By 2000 and 2001, Intel was rolling out mobile-optimized Pentium 3 and then Pentium M designs with features like speed-step technology that dynamically adjusted clock speeds to save power, conceptually echoing some of Transmeta's ideas, but executed within Intel's familiar x86 in hardware approach. Pentium M in particular, later branded under the Centrino platform, delivered strong performance per watt, significantly improving laptop battery life while maintaining or surpassing desktop-class speeds. AMD also pushed into more efficient mobile variants of its Athlon line. Crucially, Intel already had deep relationships with major OEMs, massive manufacturing capacity, and the ability to price aggressively. For a laptop maker weighing risk, betting on a tiny startup with an unproven architecture was a far bigger gamble than using Intel's increasingly power-savvy chips. Transmeta had hoped its early move into low-power design would give it a durable edge. Instead, it found itself squeezed. Intel and AMD could adopt many of the same power management philosophies while leveraging far more mature ecosystems and fabs. Beyond competition, Transmeta faced structural disadvantages. Unlike Intel and AMD, Transmeta was a so-called fabless company. It designed chips but relied on outside foundries to manufacture them. That model can work well, but it left Transmeta with less control over process technology and yields. Reports from the era suggest that Transmeta struggled at times with manufacturing yields and ramping up production volume. Even without exact figures, it's clear that the company never reached the economies of scale that allowed Intel to push costs down and flood the market. Meanwhile, OEMs building laptops are conservative by nature. They care about supply stability, long-term roadmaps, and the assurance that a processor vendor will still be around in 5 or 10 years. For many, Transmeta's financial fragility and smaller scale were red flags. So, even when Crusoe fit a device concept nicely, like a fanless sub-notebook, the business case could be shaky. A design win with a small experimental product line was not the same as displacing Intel in mainstream notebooks. From a narrative standpoint, Transmeta had set an almost impossible bar for itself. Years of secrecy, bold hints about revolutionizing computing, the halo of Paul Allen's money and Linus Torvalds' presence, all of that created expectations that Crusoe would simply blow past Intel. When reviewers and enthusiasts finally got their hands on Crusoe-based machines, the reality felt more nuanced. Yes, the chips could be cool and efficient, but they were also slower, sometimes noticeably so, than similarly priced Intel systems. Battery life gains, while real in some cases, often didn't justify the performance trade-off for mainstream buyers. Some of Transmeta's marketing messages, such as dramatic all-day usage scenarios, were interpreted as hard promises rather than best-case examples. When everyday users saw 3 or 4 hours instead of 8 or more, disappointment followed. The performance discussion around Crusoe was not entirely objective. Some critics were skeptical of the software translation idea from the start. But the core point stood. Transmeta's chips did not decisively outperform Intel's mobile offerings in the ways that mattered most to mass-market laptops. The gap between the revolution people expected and the incremental advantages actually delivered proved damaging. Transmeta didn't give up with Crusoe. In the early 2000s, it introduced a successor architecture called Efficeon. Efficeon aimed to improve performance, add support for newer instruction set extensions, and remain true to the low-power, code morphing-based philosophy. On paper and in some benchmarks, Efficeon made solid strides compared to Crusoe. It could better compete with mid-range mobile chips, and it found its way into a handful of thin and light notebooks, embedded systems, and niche devices. But by this point, Intel's Pentium M and later the early Core-based mobile processors had redefined expectations for laptop performance per watt. OEMs that might have been intrigued by Transmeta in 1999 or 2000 now had a safer high-volume option that delivered both speed and battery life. Transmeta began to shift from being a pure chip vendor towards emphasizing intellectual property and licensing, effectively saying, if we can't beat Intel at shipping processors, maybe we can license our low-power and code morphing techniques to others. It was a strategic pivot born as much out of necessity as of opportunity. Throughout the mid-2000s, Transmeta focused increasingly on monetizing its technology rather than winning new processor design wins. It licensed aspects of its long-run power management technology and its low-power design expertise to companies such as NEC and others. One of the most visible episodes of this era was Transmeta's patent litigation against Intel. The company claimed that Intel had infringed on several of its power-saving and low-power design patents, arguably echoing some of the ideas Transmeta had championed earlier. The dispute ended in 2007 with a settlement. Intel agreed to pay Transmeta hundreds of millions of dollars and to license certain Transmeta patents. That settlement, while a financial lifeline, was also a kind of epilogue. It highlighted that Transmeta's ideas had real value and influence, but that the money was coming more from legal and licensing maneuvers than from selling chips. By this stage, Transmeta was a far cry from the ambitious startup that had promised to dethrone Intel. Staff cuts, restructurings, and strategic resets reflected a company fighting to find a sustainable role in a market that had largely moved past it. As the 2000s drew to a close, Transmeta's independence was coming to an end. After years of financial struggles, limited product traction, and a growing focus on intellectual property, the company became an acquisition target. In 2009, Transmeta was acquired by a company called Novaphora, an Israeli startup focused on video processing chips. The exact strategic fit between Novaphora's plans and Transmeta's technology was not entirely clear even at the time, and within a few years, Novaphora itself was reported to be winding down. Much of Transmeta's intellectual property ended up being sold or licensed onward, disappearing into the portfolios of larger players. The fate of the original Transmeta team was more diffuse. Some engineers and executives moved on to roles at major chip companies, startups, and research labs. Linus Torvalds, whose presence had drawn so much attention, had always maintained his role in the Linux community and ultimately returned full-time to kernel development. The company name faded from headlines, but its patents and ideas lived on, embedded in legal agreements, and arguably, in the design philosophies of later low-power processors. Looking back from today's world of smartphones, ultrabooks, and cloud servers, Transmeta's core ideas feel less alien than they did in 2000. Dynamic binary translation, the concept behind code morphing, has become a standard tool in many contexts, from just-in-time compilation in software runtimes to compatibility layers that let one architecture run code written for another. While the specific implementation used in Crusoe was unique, the broader notion that software can bridge instruction set gaps is now widely accepted. The focus on performance per watt has also become central. Modern mobile processors, from ARM-based smartphone chips to Apple's M series and Intel's and AMD's latest laptop CPUs, are obsessed with squeezing maximum work out of each joule of energy. Techniques like dynamic voltage and frequency scaling, fine-grained power gating, and sophisticated power management firmware all echo the priorities Transmeta championed. Even the idea of reconfigurable or updatable microcode and firmware that can change processor behavior post-silicon has become more commonplace. While it's an overstatement to credit Transmeta alone for these trends, Crusoe stood as an early, high-profile embodiment of them. In the end, Transmeta's story is a reminder that brilliant engineering is only one part of building a lasting technology company. On a technical level, Crusoe and Efficeon were daring experiments, a bet that clever software translation and minimalist hardware could outmaneuver the entrenched giants of the x86 world. In some ways, they were right about the future. The industry did shift towards power efficiency, software-defined behavior, and performance per watt. But timing, execution, and market dynamics worked against them. Intel and AMD responded faster than many expected, closing the efficiency gap while keeping their performance lead. Manufacturing scale, OEM conservatism, and underwhelming real-world benchmarks eroded Transmeta's early mystique. By the time its patents and ideas were fully appreciated, Transmeta was no longer a contender, but a source of licensing revenue and legal settlements. Today, Crusoe is remembered less as the chip that killed x86 and more as a fascinating what-if, a glimpse of an alternate path for processor design. It stands as a cautionary tale of how even visionary technology can be undone by market realities, and how, in the relentless contest of the semiconductor industry, good ideas alone are never quite enough.